Good morning, everyone. This is a continuation of our review of a book by Patrick Gray entitled Paul, the Apostle and His Critics Through the Centuries. This was a work that sought to catalog all the main anti-Paul statements through history and movements of that sort. But when he gets to Tertullian, the most important of all anti-Paul statements and reviews, he literally only has these words that are reflective of the topic. He says, the wariness of writers like Tertullian does not reflect any rebuke of Paul. And indeed it did. We'll see why. And what he specifically rebuked him on is he's not an apostle of Jesus, nor on par with the 12. That's all you need to know. And that's unequivocal, and he can't take it back. And there was an important reason why he had to say all this. And we're going to get into Marcion, who was a heretic of 144 AD. He was a bishop at Rome. He decided that Paul was the only apostle. The 12 needed to be rejected. And there was a father God now, and there was a God, Yahweh, who was going to be in a show with the people of Israel. And basically he's a bad God, but there's a good God, and there's Jesus, and you're saved by faith alone, and all of these things. So that's what he is confronting. And he's going to destroy the Marcion movement by saying, number one, Paul's not an apostle of Jesus Christ. And second, even if he was an apostle in some sense, he was not on par with the 12, and his words are inferior. And if he doesn't get confirmed or have the authority of the 12, he can't operate. He's not valid in and of himself. All right, so let's take a look at what this book is about. I want to introduce Gray again one more time again, and so you know the context in which he's writing and what his point of view is going to be. Full title of Gray's work is Paul is a Problem in History and Culture, the Apostle and His Critics Through the Centuries. You can buy it at Kindle for $18.14 or the Google Play edition for $17.82. This is a book from the Christian publishing house, Baker Publishing, that anyone who makes a serious study of Paul should acquire. It purports to be a comprehensive historical review of those critical of Paul throughout the centuries, a review of, quote, those who regard him as a problem. Kindle, $252, $285. It is found endorsement as a, quote, versatile volume to be used in the, quote, classroom or for personal reading. That's at exploringchurchhistory.com. Quote, it is a handy resource for scholars or anyone else who wishes to track down original sources that reflect anti-Paulinism. That's Lutheran Quarterly, 2016. The author, an associate professor of religious studies at Rhodes College, appears to aid Paul's defense, but he never is too out in the open about doing so. Hence, on the surface, it is mostly an objective presentation. Thus, for what it does discuss, it is typically a useful overview. However, Gray never acknowledges there is a legitimate Bible-based reason to reject the writings of Paul. He instead implies most of the time that only those who, quote, despise Paul, reject Paul or his writings. The criticism of Paul is largely attributed by Gray to a nonstop stream of hateful slander, not recognizing anyone ever having criticized Paul to seriously defend Yahweh, God, or Jesus, with the sole exception of Kierkegaard. All right, so now let's dive into Tertullian. Where is Tertullian, Mr. Gray? I have one final criticism. Where is Tertullian's scathing criticism of Paul's authority as an alleged apostle of Jesus in Tertullian's book Against Marcion from 207 AD? Or Tertullian's comment that Paul's words fit what Jesus warned about coming from a false prophet? What about Tertullian's many biblical proofs that Paul's claim in Galatians to being an apostle of Jesus Christ was an invalid, self-serving one, unconfirmed anywhere in the Gospels and disproved by the events of Acts 15, where Paul had to visit the 12 to prove his doctrine on circumcision? Gray certainly at least should have quoted Tertullian's most blunt conclusion after laying out those proofs, where Tertullian tells Marcion is his opponent. This Marcion fellow we'll get into in a bit. He believes Paul's the only apostle, and that the 12 are basically false apostles of a different God, Yahweh, who all of them will live in Sheol, the land of the dead. But if you want to go to heaven, the land where the Father is and that Jesus is, you have to be a follower only of Paul. That's what Marcion taught. And you're saved by faith alone. If there's one thing, this is Tertullian, if there's one that makes a false claim to be Christ, much more can there be one who professes that he's an apostle of Christ. Let the apostle Paul belong to your other God, i.e. the New Testament God, Marcion said, justifies a new dispensation of faith alone with no more law, meaning the false Christ of Marcion, this lawless Christ, if you will. Tertullian against Marcion, Oxford University Press at 509 and 511. Now, I'm going to actually read these things now, and I They're going to be a little bit long, but I think it's important that we know what he says. And then we're going to go into another reading, go over here, where Paul is referred to as the heretic's own apostle. So he even refers to Paul as the apostle of the heretics. So he's not apostle of Jesus Christ. He's the apostle of the heretics. So he's not apostle of Jesus Christ, is proven over and over. And then Paul is referred to as the apostle of the heretics. We're going to go through Marcionism so you can understand why is Tertullian even writing this book to defeat Marcionism. And I just want to give you a little intro to that before I read the long section I showed you before. So let's just take a quick look here at the background on Marcionism. On Marcionism. In 144 AD, one particular ex-bishop of the church named Marcion, the Catholic Church. Well, the Roman Church, I should say. There was no Catholic Church as you know today until the 300s. Ex-bishops of the Roman Church named Marcion proclaimed three core teachings. Salvation by faith alone, quote, the good God in the New Testament redeems those who believe in him, but he does not judge those who are disobedient to him. That's Marcion's Antitheses, number 19. So Marcion had a book called Antitheses where he put forth his major propositions, and that was one of them, faith alone. 2, the law was not given by God the Father and could be disregarded. And 3, Jesus did not come in sinful human flesh, but only appeared to have a body of human flesh. So if you know anything about Apostle John referring to what is the doctrine of the Antichrist, is that Jesus does not have human flesh. He just looks like he's a human being. He's not a real human. Marcion relied upon Paul exclusively for doctrine. He rejected any of the Gospels written by the 12 apostles. Marcion claimed they were written solely for Jews. In a sense, he was simultaneously dispensational and sola scriptura. His claim that Paul alone had the correct gospel of dispensation allowed Marcion to shuffle aside any of the apostles' writings as unimportant if they did not match Paul's gospel. We have seen previously that Paul indeed taught, quote, salvation by faith alone, Romans 4, verse 4, Ephesians 2, 8-9. Even unrepentant, disobedient Christians committing incest are saved, 1 Corinthians 5, 5. Next, the law of Moses was given to Moses by angels who are, quote, not gods, and no obedience to the law was therefore necessary. Galatians 3, verse 17, Galatians 3, 19-29, and Galatians 4, 8-9. Jesus only appeared to come in sinful human flesh, Romans 8:3, and Jesus only appeared to be a man, Philippians 2:7. Yet despite Paul teaching the three core teachings of Marcion, Marcion was rejected universally by the post-apostolic church leaders. Marcion was a serious threat to the survival of Christianity. Marcion had created a church system with many churches. Marcionite churches had bishops and teachers. Marcion's church was in almost every land and community. Some believe in certain cities there were more Marcionites than Orthodox Christians, meaning normative Christians. The Encyclopedia Britannica in Marcion reflects this understanding. The Marcionite sect, highly ascetic and celibate, grew rapidly until it was second in strength only to the original church. It had churches in an episcopal hierarchy and practiced the sacraments of baptism and the Eucharist. Marcion rejected the Old Testament and almost all of the New Testament, meaning all of the apostles, Mark, Matthew. Now, he does use Luke, so we'll get into that, but he didn't like Matthew, he didn't like Mark, and he didn't like John, basing his teachings on 10 of the epistles of St. Paul and on an altered version of the Gospel of Luke. Marcionism flourished in the West until about the 4th century. Thus, Tertullian was the voice of orthodoxy. He was the most prominent voice in the cause against Marcion. Tertullian's words must have been crucial to defeat Marcionism. What was the main point of Tertullian's attack on Marcion? As we shall see, Tertullian primarily attacks Marcion for his undue reliance on Paul. Paul's apostleship is dubious, Tertullian explains. Likewise, Tertullian believed Paul was not an authority on par with the 12 apostles. If Paul contradicts the 12, Paul's words are not to be followed. When Tertullian wants to isolate those contradictions, Tertullian is circumspect. Tertullian finds flaws in Pauline doctrines without citing Paul as a source of Marcion's wrong ideas. However, we can recognize Paul's words in Marcion's mouth. What cannot be ignored is that in Marcionism, we have the first of representatives of what today would otherwise pass as an evangelical Protestant sect. Even Marcion's view of the God of the Old versus the God of the New appears today in the repackaged form of dispensational theology. The virtue of modern dispensationalism is that it does not expose the advocate to an accusation of polytheism. Instead, it only exposes the advocate to the charge that God changes his nature in time. Thus, Marcion forced the early church to weigh modern Pauline theology, yet the post-apostolic church of 125 AD to 325 AD clearly rejected Marcion and his Pauline theology. Tertullian demonstrates Paul is inferior to the other apostles. So now I want to show you right off the bat, when he's looking at, is Paul of the same authority as the other apostles? So is he an apostle on the same level? So you'll see he's going to say no, he's not. And that means he's not an apostle of Jesus Christ. He's somebody who claims he's an apostle, and then that'll be the next point he'll get to. Can Paul even claim to be an apostle, given there is no verification from that from Jesus at anywhere in the book of Acts 9, chapter 9, 22 and 20 and 26. All right, so let's listen to this section. In book 4, chapter 2 of Tertullian's Against Marcion, written 207 AD approximately, Tertullian clearly says Paul's authority is inferior to that of the 12 apostles. Tertullian explains Paul's gospel is only valid so long as it is consistent with Jesus and the 12. First, Tertullian starts out by emphasizing the priority of the gospels written by the actual 12 apostles, namely the gospels of Matthew and John. Those of Luke and Mark were inferior because they were produced merely by disciples of their teachers. Later, Tertullian identifies Luke and Mark as apostolic men, but not apostles. Tertullian writes. All right, so we're going to be reading from Tertullian Adversus Marcionism, edited by and translated by Ernest Evans. It's from Oxford at the Clarendon Press, 1972, and printed in London. All right, so let's go take a look at it. Tertullian. I lay it down to begin with that the documents of the gospel have the apostles for their authors, and that this task of promulgating the gospel was imposed upon them by our Lord Jesus himself. If they also have for their authors apostolic men, yet these stand not alone, but as companions of apostles or followers of apostles. So what he's saying is we have apostles who were commissioned by Christ, and we have those who are apostolic men. They're not actually apostles, but they were commissioned by the apostles or were companions of apostles. So they're at a different level. He's showing you there's two levels to consider. And of course, Matthew and John are on the apostolic level, but those who are companions of apostles would be Luke and Mark. Now, continuing, because the preaching of disciples might be made suspect of the desire of vainglory unless they stood by it, the authority of their teachers, or rather the authority of Christ, which made the apostles teachers. So now he's saying, if you had another principle where you could claim that even though you're not an apostle, that you had the same status of him in writing a gospel, then you would be subject to the risk of being considered proud. Like, why do you have this authority? It's not been given to you by Christ. So that's why he's saying you need to draw these lines. Actually, it's a very logical thing he's doing here. Next, in short, from among the apostles, the faith is introduced to us by John and by Matthew. So the apostles are John and Matthew of the four. While from among apostolic men, those who are not apostles, are Luke and Mark. They give it renewal. So they basically restate and reaffirm similar points. All of them beginning with the same rules of belief or faith, as far as relates to the one only God, the Creator, and to his Christ. It matters not that the arrangement of their narratives varies, so long as there is agreement on the essentials of the faith. And on these, they show no agreement with Marcion. So John and Matthew do not agree with Marcion. Doesn't believe in faith alone, doesn't believe that there's a God the Father who's different from God Yahweh. Okay, Marcion, on the other hand, attaches to his gospel no author's name. So he's going to tell you he thinks it's Luke because of similarities. But there's a dissimilarity, particularly, as I told you, there's no virgin birth. That's a very striking thing. And scholars have said if there had been, that would have been exactly matching the desire of Marcion, because it would fit his theology perfectly. As though he, to whom it was no crime to overturn the whole body, might not assume permission to invent a title for it as well. At this point, so in other words, even though, why is he not telling you it's Luke and whatever, he doesn't want to give that away, apparently, who wrote this book, this gospel he's using, Marcion. At this point, I might have made a stand, arguing that no recognition is due to a work which cannot lift up its head, which makes no show of a courage, which gives no promise of credibility by having a fully descriptive title. So he's saying, I could be a hard guy about this, that, how can I even trust even having this dialogue with you when you haven't told us whose gospel this is? But he admits it later, you'll see that it's likely Luke, and the requisite indication of the author's name. But I prefer to join issue on all points, nor am I leaving unmentioned anything that can be taken as being in my favor. For out of those authors whom we possess, Marcion is seen to have chosen Luke as the one to mutilate. So he's agreeing it's been changed. Obviously, the virgin birth is not present. And that's probably what he means by mutilation here. Now, Luke was not an apostle, but an apostolic man, not a master, but a disciple. So is he an apostle? No. So he's trying to make sure you understand Luke's gospel is not apostolic. He's not an apostle. In any case, less than his master. So he's a less authority than the true apostles' works of Matthew and John. And assuredly, even more of lesser count as being the follower of a later apostle, Paul. So then Luke, this is key, Luke is even lower, lower than Mark and Luke himself, because Paul himself is a follower of someone who is a follower of a different apostle, not one of the 12, but of Apostle Paul. Now that's his view, that Luke is a follower of Paul, to be sure. So that even if Marcion had introduced his gospel in the name of Paul in person, now listen to this, that one single document would not be adequate for our faith if destitute of the support of his predecessors. So if the 12 don't affirm Paul's gospel of Luke, then it wouldn't matter. You wouldn't listen to it just because if Paul is his source. If Paul is his only source, then it has no validity unless the 12 validated it. I'm going to pause again here, is that Tertullian is definitely unaware of any validation of Luke by the 12 apostles. So he leaves him in this category of his only apostolic connection to anyone is Paul, and Paul is inferior to the 12. Luke is not connected at all to anyone but Paul, as far as he knows, and that's even lesser authority because he's not even an apostle of Jesus Christ. Follow the logic, please. Tertullian continues, for we should demand the production of that gospel also which Paul found. See, so Paul doesn't have his own gospel. He has no right to have his own gospel. So what we want to demand is the production of that gospel also which Paul found in existence, that to which he gave his assent, that with which shortly afterwards he was anxious that his own should agree. Paul says that, I went to go see them to make sure I wasn't running ahead of them, so that my gospel would agree with theirs. For his intention going up to Jerusalem to know and to consult the apostles was lest perchance he had run in vain. That is less perchance he had not believed as they did, or were not preaching the gospel in their manner. So he is reading Paul correctly. Now later you'll see Paul will say, I didn't get anything from them. But he's inconsistent. Paul's totally inconsistent. But Tertullian is holding him to his word that that's what you went there for. You said you went back to see them to make sure you hadn't run ahead of them and you hadn't been going further than you should have with your gospel. At length, when he had conferred with the original apostles and there was agreement concerning the rule of faith, they joined the right hands of fellowship and from thenceforth divided their spheres of preaching, so that the others should go to the Jews, but Paul to Jews and Gentiles. Now, this is actually a schism, and he's not telling you about the fact that this means that the 12 apostles are going their own way and telling Paul, you can go your own way. But they're not giving up on the Gentiles, and we have proof of that. They continue to evangelize in Rome, and that's where Peter dies. He dies in a Gentile land. Okay, so why was he doing that? Because he's not just serving the Jews. He's out still evangelizing Gentiles. Okay, but that's how this is all Paul's portrayal, and he's adopting Paul's portrayal. It suits Tertullian to go along with that, because ultimately Paul is saying, I had to get their authority to do anything, even if I wanted to go off to the Gentiles. I had to get their authority. That's what he's saying. If he, therefore, who gave the light to Luke, chose to have his predecessor's authority for his faith, if Paul, therefore, who gave the light to Luke, meaning he believes Luke is the apostle of Luke is following Paul, and if he, Paul, therefore, who gave the light to Luke, chose to have Paul's predecessor's authority, meaning the apostles, the 12 apostles' authority for his faith, as well as his preaching, much more must I require for Luke's gospel the authority which was necessary for the gospel of his master. So in other words, he needs to find, not that Paul authorized Luke, he has to find Luke had authority from the 12. What Tertullian's going to next do is he's going to now prove that Paul is not even an apostle of Jesus Christ, and therefore that tells you this Luke gospel that he's relying upon, it has no authority because it's coming from, doesn't come from an apostle of Jesus Christ. It comes from Paul, an apostle of nobody. Okay, so that's the whole point. Did you see where he's driven this argument? He's made it narrow so that Paul's entire validity hinges on whether he's got a gospel of his own that he can independently have of the 12 or not. And if he is not an apostle of Jesus Christ, he can't have validity on par with the 12. So Luke's authority, coming only from Paul, has no support, and therefore Luke's gospel is what drops out. That's what he's saying here. And the first half about Tertullian here, and let's just recount where we are. We've established so far with Tertullian that Paul was not on par with the 12. And how does he know that? Because Paul himself bowed the knee to them. He had to go rush to them to see if his gospel was correct and if he was following what they said. And so he definitely said he was seeking their confirmation. He didn't have the confidence to believe his supposed relationship with Jesus in the third heaven had authority equal to theirs. So he didn't have that confirmation. He had to go to them. And then later he admits that when they separated, he didn't just have an authority to go to Gentiles without the 12 authorizing him to do so. So that's when he had the schism, which I call the schism, but others call the separation treaty, is they separated territories. Now, that's not true. I've told you that in the video, but meaning that it's not true that the 12 gave up the Gentile ministry totally to Paul. That's not what they did. They continued to minister. Matthew goes all the way to Persia. Thomas goes all the way to India. You can't possibly contain these people, and there are no in Persia. There's no Jews, and there's no Jews in India. Okay, so they're literally evangelizing the world. Now, maybe there are some Jews, but that's not their mission. Their mission is to spread to the nations, because that was the commandment of Jesus in the end of Matthew. But anyway, so I'm going to end it here. What we will pick up next time is the very important big argument he makes that Marcion, you're claiming that Paul is the only apostle, the 12 don't matter at all. Well, you don't even have proof that Paul was an apostle of Jesus Christ. And if you look at the records that we have, Book of Acts, for example, there is no mention of Paul being an apostle of Jesus Christ anywhere in the chapters that deal with the appearance of Jesus on the road to Damascus. He never says, "You're going to be my apostle." Never. So he'll have more proof on that. I'm just giving you a synopsis ahead of time. So look for this next part, which will continue this. And I did this because I wanted to make these about 20 minutes long each instead of 40 minutes. I always try to keep things towards less than 30 minutes or around that range. And this was going over. And so I thought, let's make it a little simpler and easier to watch the two of these episodes on 2 separate days. So I hope that helps everybody. All right, I hope you look forward for the next episode. I'll also put a link in the description of this video, how to get to the next video, because I'll put in that next video link into this one. All right, God bless. Take care. Ciao. Bye.